America didn't collapse because it was invaded. It collapsed because it lost the ability to hold itself together. China watched that happen in real time and decided it would not repeat the mistake. Chinese strategists didn't ask whether the American empire was evil or good. They asked a colder question. Why did a system that powerful stop working? And the reason this question mattered so much is because China has seen this movie before. Not once, but over and over again. Dynasties rise, peak, decay, and fall. China has lived through the death of empires for thousands of years. So when the American-led order began to fracture, it didn't look shocking from Beijing. It looked familiar. To Americans, the idea that the United States could die sounds dramatic. The country still exists. The flag still flies. The military is still enormous. But empires don't die in a single moment. They don't vanish overnight. They hollow out. They lose coherence. They stop believing in the rules that once held them together. By the time the fall becomes obvious, the real collapse already happened years earlier. At its height, the American empire dominated the world in a way no previous power ever had. After 1945, the United States didn't just defeat its rivals. It rewrote the global system. It controlled the world's reserve currency. It built the financial institutions. It shaped the rules of trade, security, and diplomacy. Its culture, corporations, and military reached into nearly every country on Earth. For decades, this system looked permanent. Then slowly it stopped working. The American order didn't unravel because another country beat it in a war. It unraveled because the internal logic of the system broke down. Political institutions stopped functioning as mechanisms for collective decision-making and turned into weapons in permanent internal conflict. Economic growth became increasingly detached from the lives of ordinary people. Trust in leadership collapsed. Every crisis exposed deeper dysfunction instead of producing reform. This is the part many Americans miss. They focus on external threats, China, Russia, terrorism, but that's not how empires usually fall. Rome didn't collapse because barbarians suddenly became stronger. The barbarians had always been there. What changed was Rome. Its politics became unstable. Its economy stopped serving the population. Its elites lost legitimacy. By the time the invasions came, the empire was already exhausted. China understands this pattern instinctively. In Chinese political thought, the most dangerous enemy is not outside the borders. It is inside the system. Corruption, factionalism, loss of legitimacy. These are the true empire killers. America's first fatal mistake was division. For most of its rise, the United States maintained a shared national story. Americans disagreed fiercely, but they accepted the same constitutional framework and basic legitimacy of the system. Over time, that consensus eroded. Politics stopped being about governing and became about defeating internal enemies. Institutions designed to resolve conflict became arenas that intensified it. Rome made the same mistake when it split its empire into competing halves. What was meant to improve governance created rivalry, mistrust, and resource competition. The system stopped pulling in one direction. America didn't formally split into East and West, but the effect was similar. Cultural, political, and informational fragmentation produced parallel realities that no longer recognized each other as legitimate. From a Chinese perspective, this was a textbook failure. Unity is not a moral preference. It is a survival requirement. Periods of Chinese history marked by fragmentation were remembered as eras of mass death, famine, and chaos. Warring states. 3 kingdoms. Disunion after the Han. These weren't romantic stories. They were civilizational traumas. The lesson was simple. Division kills. The second mistake was internal decay disguised as prosperity. For years, America appeared wealthy and stable on paper. Stock markets rose. Corporate profits surged. Technological innovation accelerated. But underneath the surface, the foundations weakened. Infrastructure aged. Debt exploded. Institutions became performative rather than functional. The economy increasingly rewarded speculation over production. This mirrors the late stages of many collapsed dynasties. On the surface, the capital still shines. The elite still live well. But the system no longer converts power into broad stability. When shocks arrive, the response is chaotic because the mechanisms of governance no longer work as intended. China's historical memory is brutal on this point. Prosperity is dangerous if it breeds complacency. Every dynasty that believed its wealth made it invincible eventually collapsed. Wealth without legitimacy accelerates decay. The third mistake was the loss of legitimacy. Empires do not survive on force alone. Rome learned this the hard way. When citizens stopped believing the empire served them, loyalty evaporated. Soldiers fought for pay, not for Rome. Officials enriched themselves instead of governing. The state became something endured rather than defended. In Chinese political philosophy, this is described as the loss of the mandate of heaven. It doesn't require religion to function. It simply means that power must be justified by performance. If the government cannot deliver stability, security, and basic welfare, it loses the right to rule. Collapse becomes inevitable. America's crisis of legitimacy followed a similar path. Faith in institutions eroded. Elections became existential battles. Economic outcomes diverged sharply across society. Each failure compounded distrust. Instead of repairing legitimacy, the system relied more heavily on narratives, blame, and external threats. China was watching all this, not as a cheering spectator, but as a student of history. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Chinese leaders did not celebrate. They panicked. They studied every decision, every reform, every moment of ideological erosion. The conclusion was clear. The system collapsed from within. The American trajectory confirmed the same lesson. China did not conclude that liberal democracy is weak in theory. It concluded that any system that loses internal cohesion, legitimacy, and discipline will eventually fail regardless of ideology. This belief now shapes how China governs, plans, and responds to crisis. America's fall, like Rome's, did not arrive with a single dramatic moment. No final battle, no official surrender. Just a slow loss of coherence. The empire didn't end because someone destroyed it. It ended because it stopped functioning as a unified system. And that is the lesson China took to heart. If you want to understand why China behaves the way it does today, you have to understand this fear. The fear of division, the fear of internal decay, the fear of losing legitimacy. In the next part, we'll look at how these lessons shape China's modern strategy and why they explain policies that outsiders consistently misunderstand. China did not respond to America's decline by trying to replace it overnight. That's another misunderstanding. Empires don't get replaced in a single handoff. They fade, fragment, and create vacuums. The powers that survive are the ones that position themselves to endure the turbulence. This is where China's historical mindset becomes critical. Western analysis often assumes that China is playing a short-term game, quarterly growth, 5-year plans, tactical advantage. But China's leadership thinks in dynastic time. Centuries, not election cycles. Survival, not dominance, is the core objective. The first priority was preventing fragmentation at all costs. From the outside, China's obsession with unity looks excessive. Harsh crackdowns, zero tolerance for separatism, relentless emphasis on central authority. To Western observers, this appears paranoid or authoritarian for its own sake. But through China's historical lens, this behavior is rational. Every major collapse in Chinese history began with fragmentation. Local elites accumulated power. Regional identities hardened. The center lost control. What followed was not freedom, but chaos. War, starvation, demographic collapse. The memory of those periods is not academic. It is cultural trauma. So when China looks at America's internal polarization, it does not see a healthy pluralism testing itself. It sees the early stages of imperial fracture, competing narratives, parallel institutions, regions and populations that no longer recognize the authority of the center. From a Chinese perspective, This is not strength. It is the precondition for collapse. The second priority was controlling internal decay. Rome collapsed after its institutions became hollow. Offices still existed. Titles still mattered. But competence disappeared. Loyalty was transactional. Corruption became normalized. The system kept moving out of habit long after it stopped functioning. China built its modern state with this failure in mind. That is why it places extraordinary emphasis on bureaucratic discipline, cadre evaluation, rotations, internal audits, anti-corruption campaigns that are not symbolic, but systemic. Yes, these campaigns consolidate power. That's undeniable, but reducing them to power grabs misses the deeper logic. In Chinese history, corruption is not a moral flaw. It is an existential threat. A corrupt official in a distant province can ignite rebellion, invite invasion, or delegitimize the entire system. America underestimated this danger. Corruption in the American system did not always look like bribery. It appeared as regulatory capture, revolving doors, financialization, institutions quietly serving narrow interests while claiming to represent the public. Over time, this eroded trust faster than any foreign adversary could. China watched closely. The lesson was not that markets are bad or openness is dangerous. The lesson was that systems must serve the population or they lose legitimacy. When legitimacy collapses, no amount of military power can save an empire. The third priority was economic structure. Empires die when their economies stop producing stability. Rome relied increasingly on extraction rather than growth. Heavy taxation crushed the productive base. Wealth concentrated at the top. The state responded to shortfalls with debasement and coercion instead of reform. America followed a modern version of this path. Manufacturing hollowed out. Financial speculation replaced productive investment. Debt substituted for real growth. For a while, the system held together because the dollar sat at the center of global finance. But this only delayed the reckoning. It did not prevent it. China's response was deliberate. It built redundancy. Supply chains, industrial capacity, strategic reserves. It accepted inefficiency in exchange for resilience. From a Western efficiency-focused perspective, this looked wasteful. From a survival perspective, it was essential. Chinese history is clear on this point. Systems optimized only for efficiency collapse under stress. Systems designed for endurance survive. The fourth priority was ideological cohesion. Rome lost not only political control, but belief. People stopped believing the empire represented order. Loyalty fragmented. Competing identities replaced shared purpose. By the end, Rome existed as an administrative shell without moral gravity. America experienced a similar erosion. The national narrative fractured. Institutions lost credibility. Every event was filtered through partisan identity. Instead of reinforcing legitimacy, ideology became a weapon used against internal rivals. China treats ideology differently, not as free expression, but as structural glue. This is why it fears what it calls ideological infiltration, not because ideas themselves are dangerous, but because loss of narrative control precedes loss of authority. In Chinese political theory, once people stop believing the system is legitimate, coercion becomes the only tool left. And coercion alone cannot sustain an empire. This is why China is obsessed with what it calls historical nihilism. Questioning foundational narratives is not treated as academic debate. It is treated as a threat to regime survival. Western observers often dismiss this as insecurity. Historically, it is pattern recognition. The fifth priority was learning from failed reforms. The Soviet Union looms large here. Chinese leaders studied its collapse obsessively. The mistake, in their view, was not reform itself. It was reform without control, liberalization without cohesion, ideological retreat before institutional resilience. America, from China's perspective, repeated this error in a different form. Institutions were open, weakened, or delegitimized without a replacement framework that could sustain trust. The result was not freedom, but fragmentation. This is why China reformed slowly, Incrementally, experimentally, localized trials before national rollout. Mistakes are contained. Failure does not cascade. The American system, by contrast, became brittle. When reforms failed, they failed nationally. When trust broke, it broke everywhere at once. China's survival strategy is not about avoiding change. It is about controlling the rate and direction of change so it does not overwhelm the system. None of this means China is immune to collapse. History guarantees no such thing. Every dynasty believed it had learned the lessons of the past. Many were wrong. But what distinguishes China is that it assumes collapse is always possible. That assumption shapes everything. Governance, economics, ideology, security. America assumed permanence. China assumes impermanence. And that difference explains why one system unraveled while the other adapted. In the next segment, we'll look at how these historical lessons translate into China's behavior on the global stage, and why America consistently misreads those actions as aggression rather than survival. When China began adjusting its behavior on the world stage, the United States misread almost every move. Washington interpreted China's actions through a moral lens. Expansion versus restraint. Democracy versus authoritarianism. Rules versus revisionism. But China was not operating inside that framework. China was operating inside a survival framework. From Beijing's perspective, the global order created by the United States was never neutral. It was an empire's operating system, dollar dominance, security alliances, trade rules, information flows. All of it reinforced American power and constrained everyone else. As long as that system functioned smoothly, the United States appeared indispensable. But once internal cohesion weakened, the system began producing instability instead of order. China watched the cracks form. Financial crises that required constant intervention. Wars that produced chaos instead of deterrence. Institutions that lost credibility. Political paralysis during emergencies. Each failure signaled not strength, but brittleness. At this point, a key divergence occurred. America responded by doubling down on external pressure, sanctions, military posturing, ideological framing. The assumption was that power projection could compensate for internal dysfunction. Historically, this is a familiar move. Declining empires externalize stress. China chose a different path. Instead of confronting the American system head-on, China worked around it. It diversified trade routes, built parallel financial infrastructure, reduced exposure to single points of failure, strengthened ties with regions historically neglected by Western power. From a Western point of view, this looked like aggression. Influence campaigns, debt traps, strategic encirclement. But from a Chinese historical perspective, it looked like risk management. Chinese dynasties learned early that direct confrontation with a dominant power is often suicidal. Survival favors patience, adaptation, indirect pressure, avoiding decisive conflict until conditions change. This logic shaped China's approach to globalization. America treated globalization as an extension of its ideology. Open markets would spread liberal values. Economic integration would produce political convergence. This assumption rested on the belief that America's internal model was stable. China treated globalization as a tool, not a destiny. Integration was acceptable as long as it strengthened domestic capacity. When it created dependency, it became dangerous. This is why China welcomed foreign capital, but insisted on technology transfer. Why it allowed market mechanisms, but kept strategic sectors under state control. Why it tolerated inequality temporarily, but feared permanent oligarchy. Rome failed here. Late Rome increasingly relied on external labor, external soldiers, and external financing. Control slipped quietly. By the time the empire realized its dependence, it had no leverage left. America repeated a modern version of this mistake. Supply chains stretched across adversarial territory. Financial markets depended on perpetual confidence. Strategic industries were offshored in pursuit of efficiency. The system worked until it didn't. China saw vulnerability where America saw optimization. Another major misreading involved China's military behavior. Western analysis often frames China's military modernization as preparation for conquest. But conquest is not the historical priority. Stability is. In Chinese history, the most dangerous periods were not times of expansion, but times of weakness that invited invasion. The goal of military power is deterrence, preventing chaos, avoiding the appearance of vulnerability. America's military posture evolved differently. It became expeditionary, forward deployed, politically entangled. Over time, military power turned to a tool of policy rather than shield of survival. This distinction matters. Empires that use force to manage internal legitimacy eventually exhaust themselves. Rome did. Continuous campaigns drained resources and morale. Soldiers became mercenaries. Loyalty eroded. China internalized this lesson. Avoid endless wars. Avoid open-ended commitments. Avoid situations where force substitutes for governance. This does not make China peaceful. It makes it cautious. The same logic explains China's sensitivity to perceived encirclement. Historically, China's greatest disasters came when internal weakness coincided with external pressure. The Mongol conquest, the Opium Wars, the Japanese invasion. In each case, fragmentation made foreign intervention catastrophic. So when China sees military alliances moving closer to its borders, it does not interpret them abstractly. It reads them historically as potential stress multipliers during moments of internal strain. America interprets these reactions as insecurity. China interprets them as memory. The informational domain reveals another contrast. America assumed that open information environments would always benefit it. Free flow of ideas, media competition, cultural influence. For decades, this was true. But information systems changed. Algorithms rewarded outrage. Narratives fractured. Trust collapsed. Information stopped producing consensus and started producing division. This accelerated America's internal decay. China responded by prioritizing narrative control, not because it feared truth, but because it feared fragmentation. In Chinese political thought, uncontrolled narratives weaken authority faster than economic decline. Rome experienced this as well. Competing belief systems, loyalties, and identities eroded cohesion. The state lost its ability to define legitimacy. America entered a similar phase. Reality itself became contested. Institutions lost their role as arbiters. Politics became permanent crisis. China watched and adjusted. This is why China invests heavily in internal messaging, education, and historical framing. The goal is not persuasion abroad. It is coherence at home. Western observers often confuse this with propaganda alone. But historically, empires that lose narrative coherence do not survive long enough to enjoy freedom of debate. Another critical difference lies in crisis response. When crises hit the American system, responses became delayed, politicized, and contested. Every decision triggered institutional conflict. Over time, crisis stopped producing unity and started accelerating fragmentation. In Chinese history, crises are legitimacy tests. Floods, famines, epidemics. Failure to respond signals loss of mandate. This creates intense pressure on the state to act decisively. Modern China inherited this expectation. Crisis competence is not optional. It is existential. America once shared this trait. Large-scale mobilization during wars. Infrastructure projects. Institutional reform after collapse. But over time, the capacity to act collectively weakened. By the time America recognized the scale of its internal dysfunction, the system had lost the ability to self-correct. China did not mistake this for moral superiority. It treated it as a warning. Empires do not fall because others rise. They fall because they lose the ability to manage complexity. America's mistake was believing that global dominance could compensate for internal fracture. China's strategy has been the opposite. Reduce exposure, build buffers, preserve cohesion. The result is not a new empire replacing an old one overnight. It is a slow shift in which one system becomes increasingly unstable while the other prioritizes survival. In the final segment, we'll examine the deepest lesson China drew from America's decline and why it shapes the future of global power more than any single policy or leader. At the deepest level, the lesson China drew from America's decline was not about ideology, technology, or even power. It was about coherence. Every empire eventually faces the same test. Can it coordinate itself under stress? Can it resolve internal conflict without tearing itself apart? Can it adapt without losing legitimacy? Rome failed this test, not because it lacked strength, but because it lost unity. America followed the same path. The signs were different, the language was modern, the institutions were more complex, but the underlying pattern was the same. China recognized that pattern early. The most important distinction is this: America believed that history had ended. China believed history never ends. For the United States, the post-Cold War moment felt final. Liberal democracy had won. Markets had won. The global system reflected American values so completely that it seemed irreversible. Internal disagreements were treated as noise, not existential threats. Institutions were assumed to be self-sustaining. That assumption shaped everything. Political polarization was tolerated because the system was believed to be resilient. Economic inequality was ignored because growth numbers looked strong. Cultural fragmentation was dismissed as freedom in action. But systems do not survive on assumptions. They survive on maintenance. China never made that mistake. Its history taught it that stability is temporary, legitimacy is fragile, and decline is always possible. That belief produced a fundamentally different approach to power. Where America externalized risk, China internalized it. American strategy focused outward, expand alliances, enforce rules, project power, shape the world in its image. When problems arose, the instinct was to search for external causes. Foreign interference, rival powers, disinformation. These explanations were not always wrong, but they were incomplete. China's strategy focused inward. Strengthen institutions, preserve unity, prevent fragmentation. When problems emerged, the assumption was internal failure, governance errors, corruption, loss of discipline, legitimacy erosion. This difference explains nearly every divergence between the two systems. It explains why America treated dissent as proof of strength, while China treated unchecked dissent as a warning sign. It explains why America prioritized efficiency, while China prioritized resilience. It explains why America trusted spontaneous order, while China feared uncontrolled complexity. Neither approach is morally pure. Both carry costs. But history is indifferent to intentions. It only rewards systems that survive. America's greatest vulnerability was not its enemies. It was its confidence. Confidence that markets would self-correct. Confidence that institutions would endure. Confidence that legitimacy, once earned, would last forever. Confidence that power projection could substitute for cohesion. Rome shared that confidence. By the time Rome realized its institutions no longer functioned, loyalty had already eroded. The army was no longer Roman in spirit. The economy no longer served the population. Politics became survival games among elites. The empire still existed in name, but it no longer acted as a single system. America reached a similar point. Institutions remained, procedures continued, elections happened, but coordination collapsed. Every decision triggered paralysis or backlash. Crisis response became politicized. Trust evaporated. This is what imperial death looks like in practice. Not ruins and smoke, but dysfunction. China survived because it built its system around the expectation of failure. This expectation produced discipline. It justified control. It sustained long-term planning. It kept legitimacy tied to performance rather than ideology alone. That does not guarantee success forever. No system escapes history. China will face its own crises, its own contradictions, its own moments of overreach and decay. But it enters those moments with a mindset shaped by collapse. America entered decline without one. This is why China studies fallen empires obsessively. Rome, the Qing, the Soviet Union, the British Empire. These are not cautionary tales told for curiosity. They are survival manuals. When Chinese leaders ask why an empire fell, they are not asking who to blame. They are asking how to avoid the same fate. America stopped asking that question. Instead of reforming institutions, it fought cultural wars. Instead of rebuilding legitimacy, it outsourced trust to narratives. Instead of addressing internal decay, it relied on external dominance. The result was predictable. Empires do not collapse when they are challenged. They collapse when they cannot respond coherently to challenge. China understood that survival in a complex world requires constraint on elites, constraint on fragmentation, constraint on ideological drift, constraint on speed. America rejected constraint in favor of spontaneity, competition, and maximal freedom, assuming strength would emerge automatically. For a time, it did. Then the system reached its limits. The final lesson is the simplest and the hardest to accept. Power does not preserve empires. Cohesion does. Rome lost cohesion and fell. America lost cohesion and declined. China, shaped by centuries of collapse and reunification, organized its system to prevent that outcome for as long as possible. This does not mean China is the future of the world. It means China learned how to survive its own past. History does not reward the most virtuous system. It rewards the system that adapts. And that is why America died as an empire, while China endured. If you want to explore more stories about how history shapes modern power, you can watch the next video on your screen. Thanks for watching.